oh, we should have perhaps invested more in domestic production. Why can't we bring food in? Because of a pandemic. So let's respect our farmers and producers and let's protect our food sovereignty.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honour to rise to speak to the budget and then this bill, C-69, as well, that implements some measures that are in it. The short of it is that, in my view, when I think about folks in my community, this budget just doesn't meet the moment that we are in. And if anything, it just seems like a similar story again where this government seems to promise and then under-deliver, or in some cases break promises altogether. I'd like to start, though, first with a couple of items that I appreciate that will help folks in my community. I think it's important to point out that there are good measures in this implementation bill. One example is there's a provision included to deny income tax deductions for non-compliant short-term rentals. It was first announced in the fall economic statement. I think it's a really important measure to move ahead with as we look to address the housing crisis and remove various incentives that are in place for those who are actually removing rental units from the housing market. Secondly, for parents who are mourning the loss of a child, there's a provision in this bill that will extend the Canada Child Benefit 6 months after a child's death, which is, the least that the federal government can do to support parents in such a difficult, unimaginable time. On the whole, though, when taking a step back at the budget and this bill, I'm concerned that it just doesn't follow through on big promises that this government made. The first I'll start with is when it comes to the promise for the Canada Disability Benefit. Here's the promise that was made in 2021 from the Liberal platform, quote, "This new benefit will reduce poverty amongst persons with disabilities in the same manner as the Guaranteed Income Supplement and the Canada Child Benefit." Both of those programs in the tens of billions of dollars a year. Instead, what is proposed in this budget is nothing that the disability community had called for. And it's not what the government had promised. The maximum amount being proposed, $200 a month, is far too little to actually reduce levels of poverty amongst folks with disabilities. Now, I'll point out, it's 40% of people living in poverty across the country are people with disabilities. I've since asked at committee for the minister to table a list of people with disabilities who will be lifted out of poverty as a result of what is being proposed in this budget. I've yet to get that list. I'm also still waiting on a list of people with disabilities who asked for what was proposed in this budget. We were told that it would take 3 years to wait on consultations from the disability community. I'm still waiting on a list of people with disabilities and organizations that serve people with disabilities that asked for this $200 a month, that asked for it to be delivered, the Canada Disability Benefit, through the disability tax credit. This is an incredibly burdensome tax credit to apply for and receive, and that requirement flies in the face of Section 11F of the Canada Disability Benefit Act, which is an amendment that I was successful in securing that requires the benefit to be barrier-free. It remains my concern that what is being proposed in Budget 2024 is actually in contravention of the Canada Disability Benefit Act, because the Canada Disability Benefit is required to be delivered barrier-free. And the disability tax credit, it is an incredibly burdensome application process. Third, the benefit itself won't even be proposed to start until July 2025, leaving people with disabilities in the exact same level of poverty as they are right now until that point. And as of that point, they'll get an extra $6 a day or so. Here's the quote from Krista Carr at Inclusion Canada. Quote, quote, "Our disappointment cannot be overstated. This benefit was supposed to lift persons with disabilities out of poverty, not merely make them marginally less poor than they already are." Another promise that this budget made, that this government made in this budget, was for tax fairness. Now, the simplest place to start, if we're going to talk about tax fairness, would be an excess profit tax on the largest oil and gas companies in the country. These are companies, the top 5 biggest in Canada alone in 2022, they made $38 billion in profits after they paid shareholders $29 billion in increased dividends and share repurchases. Now, this government has already introduced in the pandemic an excess profit tax on banks and life insurance companies. They called it the Canada Recovery Dividend. I've proposed in Motion 92 for them to do the same thing and apply it to oil and gas companies. And it's been advocated by groups like Environmental Defence, the David Suzuki Foundation, Climate Action Network Canada, Canadians for Tax Fairness, because it's a reasonable measure. A one-time tax even on the profits, even just 15% of those profits over $1 billion would generate $4.2 billion that could be used to help Canadians with day-to-day life, to help incentivize more public transit, reduced fares, and increased service. It could help with incentives for home energy retrofits, for example, as folks in Ontario and my community continue to wait for the new version of the Greener Home Grant program, for example. What did we get in this budget? Well, we got whispers that it was in it a few weeks before the budget came out. But the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, well, they had 30 meetings with the federal government in just the 3 months before the budget came out. The Pathways Alliance, they got another 23 meetings in the months before the budget came out. And I guess their blitz of lobbying was successful. For them, at least, for their corporate greed, well, the windfall profit tax is nowhere to be seen. But when it comes to our children's future, when it comes to being serious about the climate crisis and at least making sure that these companies pay some measure of additional tax if they're going to gouge us at the pumps, it's nowhere to be found. I'll briefly talk about housing affordability, recognizing I'm short on time. The budget promised to make housing affordable. What does it deliver? Well, there's a plan that counts in its projections 800,000 new homes that are going to be built as a result of other levels of government being impressed with this government. And there's actually a reduction in funding for nonprofits who want to build the deeply affordable housing we need. I'm really concerned about the Rapid Housing Initiative, for example, and this is true for MPs across the country who have nonprofits in their communities who want to build affordable housing. Our stock of social housing in this country is down to 3.5%. It's the lowest in the G7. If we doubled social housing, we'd still just be middle of the pack. Well, when it comes to the Rapid Housing Initiative, it used to be $750 million a year. As of this year, it looks like this budget is proposing only $100 million total right across the country. Now, the budget also promised to fix the Impact Assessment Act. What it delivered? A complete renouncing of federal jurisdiction over nationally significant greenhouse gas emissions of major projects. Projects, for example, like Highway 413 in Ontario that currently the Ontario government plans to move ahead with. Here's what 14 leading environmental NGOs, including the West Coast Environmental Law, Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and Greenpeace had to say about what's in this bill. Quote, "The Supreme Court of Canada said Canada should have explained when and how GHG emissions become a matter of national concern. The federal government should seize that opportunity, not abandon its responsibilities to Canadians and the environment." I know my colleague, the member for Saanich Gulf Islands, will have more to say about this. Now, there are also some items in this bill I'm not going to have time to get into that weren't promised at all, including a plan to expand immigration detention into federal prisons being panned by former Liberal cabinet ministers. On the whole, though, this government needs to do more to follow through on the big promises it makes. And it's true that whether it's a young person thinking about their climate future or folks with disabilities, we're going to need far more organizing to get the budget and the legislation that we need.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indigenous Services.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his speech this evening and for his passion and commitment, and I certainly support him on the, going further on environmental initiatives. Something I thought that was very positive in the budget was dedicated funding for friendship centres. I know that this is very much welcome news in my part of the world, and I'm just wondering if there's a friendship centre in the members' riding that could benefit from some of this funding. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is another example of a positive initiative that's not in C-69 in the bill, but it is in the budget. It's important funding. We do not have a friendship centre in Waterloo Region. It is something that Indigenous leaders have been calling for, both in terms of land and funding to build, and it's certainly an important measure that is in the budget.
And comments? The Honourable for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
I'm wondering if the member, in his analysis of the disability part of the budget, could tell us whether or not, or describe the protections against provincial clawbacks and any protections against the disability tax credit promoters who fill out these forms, as they do for the disability tax credit, charge an unreasonable fee, and then take a percentage of all future benefits.
The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
It's an excellent question. Protection from clawbacks is something that this government has been using as one of the rebuttals, I'm hearing, for why the benefit wasn't higher. But there's actually a provision in the Canada Disability Benefit Act that is meant to address this. It's an amendment that I was successful with over a year ago that requires the agreements between provinces, territories, and the federal government to be made public. And so those who are saying that they're concerned they can't go further without a clawback being applied, well, the agreement will be made public afterwards, and so no province or territory should attempt to do it because Canadians and folks with disabilities will judge them for it. Now, we also should mention, though, that the Senate had improved the bill that would have done more to prevent the insurance industry from clawing back any benefits from folks with disabilities. That amendment was rejected by this government. It continues to be a significant concern with what's being proposed in the Canada Disability Benefit, as is using the disability tax credit. They should move away from that altogether to make sure that folks with disabilities have barrier-free access to the benefit.
Questions and comments? L'Honorable Député de Beau.
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. You know that hell is paved with good intentions, and this budget also seems to be paved with good intentions, also with interference. My colleague talked about financial support for people who have disabilities. People in my riding have written to me and said they have had a lot of hope in this support, and now they're writing me, they're saying that these amounts are insulting. And everything in terms of social support, it's Quebec jurisdiction. Does my colleague not agree that the federal government should respect its own jurisdiction that it manages and also allow the provinces to support people who have difficulties? Thank you.
The Honourable Member Kitchener Centre.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I agree with my Bloc colleague, the Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou, in terms of the fact that this government talks a lot about good intentions, but in my opinion, for people with disabilities, provincial and territorial benefits are insufficient because they remain under the poverty line. So in my opinion, the federal government has to create something, a benefit, to enhance the support and go further. to increase basic income for all people who have disabilities across the country.
Resuming debate, the